Good evening, everyone. Good evening. My name is Joel Silverstein. I'm an artist, and I'm a good friend of Arlen's. Arlen actually asked me to give him the personal touch of the introduction. I've known Arlen for about 6 or 8 years already, I guess, right? We've worked on several projects together. We've both curated comic art shows. We've both been in each other's shows. I have enormous respect for this man. I just wanted to say also.
I wish I could say the same.
Well, I'll even take that, okay? Anyway, I want to start off by saying that I had Arlen's book, The Silver Age, in my library for years. And then when I met him, it was this incredible big deal. I have to say that Arlen is one of the experts on the Silver Age of comics, which Silver Age runs from like the 50s into what?
56 to 70. 56 to 70.
Right. Okay.
Best book ever on the Silver Age.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Of course, the one thing I forgot to bring with me is my book, but go online, everything's there.
Okay, let's go over some of Arlen's other accomplishments beside that book. As you know, he's also an expert on Bruce Springsteen. He's written a book on Springsteen, right?
Well,
He's written
unpublished.
a book on The Twilight Zone, which was published and hopefully will be published again with annotations and expanded edition. I've seen his books that haven't been published, but as an again, I'm a fine artist, but I'm a huge comics nerd and have curated several comic art shows, and my artwork also has comic stuff in it. So we always have stuff to talk about, and it's neat because there's that crossover between graphic design, fine art, comic book art, and commercial art, and we always talk about that mix. Okay, he's done an incredible book on the Max Fleischer Superman cartoons, yet to be published. Also, another incredible book on
Irish Snap.
On
Irish Snap.
the Snap. He did a curated show on Snap, who was the graphic designer for the Silver Age in DC. If you've seen a logo of Superman or the Flash or the Justice League from that period, Snap was the man who did that. He did this incredible both book and exhibition based on that. So you can see not only is Arlen's taste based on just his taste, but he's a real comics historian. He's really, first of all, he's a great showman. I have to say that. As you will hear, he's an incredible showman, and his talks are incredibly energetic, okay? But he has the knowledge. Not only does he have the taste, he has the knowledge to really make you feel the historical context. Who was good? Who was the best? What style? Why is the style interesting? Who was doing the inking? Who was doing the penciling? So he's going to be talking more about that. I just want to say, I'm really honored to introduce this guy. He's really great. Give me a hug.
I love you, Joel. That was a great fucking intro.
Okay, there you go.
Thank you, Joel. Okay, do we have to turn this mic off? Okay. Everybody, thank you for being here. Just to let you know, I'm going to be presenting roughly 2 45-minute sets with a little 5 or 10-minute break in between, depending on the mood of the crowd, because it is Steve Ditko, and to do a proper retrospective just needs that amount of time, but I hope you'll find it worth it. Okay, let me get to the beginning here. And thank you again for being here. It really means a lot to me that you came out for Steve Ditko and myself. Okay, Yaman, are we ready? Rachel, are we ready with video? Ready. Okay, here we go. Make sure the sound is up. Okay, here we go.
Spider-Man, Spider-Man, does whatever a spider can. Spins a web any size, catches thieves just like flies. Look out, here comes the Spider-Man. Is he strong? Listen, bud, he's got radioactive blood. Can he swing from a thread? Take a look overhead. Hey there goes the Spider-Man. In the chill of night, at the scene of a crime, like a streak of light, he arrives just in time. Spider-Man, Spider-Man, friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Wealth and fame, he's ignored. Action is his reward to him. Life is a great big hang-up. Wherever there's a hang-up, you'll find the Spider-Man.
That, ladies and gentlemen, is the last panel, postage stamp size, of the very first page of the very first Spider-Man origin story from August of 1962. And what is it known for? Stan Lee's dialogue, with great power, there must also come great responsibility. But we're not here to talk about Stan Lee tonight. We're here to talk about the artist, the magnificent, the one and only, the great Steve Ditko, who walked away from his greatest creation, Spider-Man. Spider-Man, who's become a worldwide icon. Here he is, of course, at the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. Now, he kind of co-created him with Stan Lee, but we'll talk about that later. But Ditko did create wholly this guy that you've seen in films. I think they're doing a second one that'll come out next year. Ditko created Doctor Strange, but also walked away from him at the same time. Most people know Steve Ditko from those two, his majorly known creations, but Ditko created a host of legacy comic characters. This is from 1960, Captain Atom, before he did Spider-Man, but DC Comics, which bought the Charlton library, is still doing Captain Atom. Ditko did a Silver Age version of the Blue Beetle, who was a 1940s character that he rebooted. DC Comics, again, they do new versions of the Blue Beetle every now and then, as well as the original Ditko classic, which is unparalleled. Then there's the character, the Question, with that unique kind of face mask design. You might know of the Question because of the character Rorschach in the film Watchmen, which is basically Alan Moore paying homage to Ditko's The Question. But the Question by itself, you can buy an action figure of. I mean, when me and my brother Steve were kids, we dreamed about action figures for these obscure characters, and now they're reality. But it shows you that he's not that obscure. Then there's another version of the Question, kind of almost like the Question's brother, the black and white Mr. A, who was judge, jury, and executioner. He appears 4 years before this guy appears in movies, and 10 years before the basic Clint Eastwood Dirty Harry of comics, the English Judge Dredd. Then in 1968, 3 years after he leaves Marvel, for DC Comics, he creates the character the Creeper. Again, not as famous, and yet on the great Batman animated series, the Creeper was a character, and DC Comics is still trotting out variations of Ditko's original. You get the Hawk and Dove that Ditko creates in the year 1968 for DC, the height of the whole Vietnam War counterculture and the fight of real-life Hawk and Doves, literally torn from the day's headlines. Of course, DC Comics, they've turned the dove into a woman. Or on the Brave and Bold animated series, they brought the dove back to being a man, and yet in the recent live-action Legends of the DC Universe on television, they brought back the female Hawk and Dove. Now, my book, The Silver Age of Comic Art, which you can get through my website, talk to me after the show, but when you open it up and you get to the title page, these are the 8 artists that did their career best work between those years of 56 to 70, that I think in the same way art historians today, like Joel, look back on the great art figure artists of the Renaissance era, like Michelangelo, Da Vinci, and Raphael. I truly believe art historians 500 years from now will look back on these men as our great masters of the human figure. And I tried to put a quote for each artist that said in one quote what they were about. And let me know afterwards if you think Ditko's work lives up to his own saying here. Each artist gets a double-page spread in which I pick their primarily portrait character, and then I ghost behind the type, to use a graphic design term, Ditko's famous characters that he drew for a fan. Ditko, throughout his whole career, would send personalized letters to fans if they wrote in something that he wanted to respond to. And of course, I used the character, the Question, that I got from this cover when we're going to talk about the story a little later on in the second half of my presentation. But basically, I tilted it, I isolated the head out. When I was looking for a poster originally for this show, I made one side negative because so much of what Ditko is about is black and white. And there is his name. This is all because I went to Rhode Island School of Design, ladies and gentlemen. I learned how to do graphic design like this, but God bless RISD. This was my original poster for the show, but because it didn't seem to be selling tickets, they said, Arlen, you should really design an image that will have his famous characters in there. So that's why we get this as my new title image. But the other reason why I chose Ditko for my first comic art history show here at the Great Triad Theater is because Ditko was also a lifelong New Yorker, even though he was born and grew up in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. This is the office building at 51st and Broadway. You know, Ditko had a reputation of being the kind of J.D. Salinger meets Greta Garbo of comics, and yet he wasn't. He was hiding in plain sight at 51st and Broadway. Now, here's a photograph. Rarely did Ditko allow himself to be photographed, so the images you're seeing from the early 60s when he was working on Spider-Man and Doctor Strange. Again, God bless the internet, because that's how you end up finding these images. I love this one with the word think on it. Ditko starts his career in the 1950s doing back then there were comics for every genre: science fiction, westerns, fantasy, superheroes, crime. But Ditko seemed to gravitate towards darker, more suspense stories. Mysterious Traveler was like an anthology with a type of phantom stranger, shadow, host character. And these are for all different companies, Charlton Comics in the 50s. But then he goes to the early version of Marvel Comics in the late 50s called Atlas. And he starts working with Stan Lee, doing short 5-page stories with little surprise endings in a comic dated, that's number 7 of December 1962. So this is right about the same time that Lee and Kirby and others are launching the Marvel superhero universe. But Ditko is doing these short stories. Now, they're signed Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. They're probably Ditko's stories that he drew out like silent movies, maybe after a conference call with Lee, and then Lee comes in and puts in the dialogue. But amazing adult fantasy and stories about the last man on Earth, if this doesn't suggest the Twilight Zone, it's because they are knockoffs. I mean, this is the ultimate Last Man on Earth Twilight Zone episode, but some of the best of the amazing, and by the way, amazing adult fantasy as a phrase is what Twilight Zone is, but there were stories about mannequins coming to life that were done on Twilight Zone 2 and 3 years earlier than Ditko was doing stories like this, where an Earthman finds himself in an alien zoo. Well, 3 years or 2 years earlier, there was this Twilight Zone episode. But even the Twilight Zone characters, who were average, everyday, even ugly people, had their visual graphic analog in Ditko's artwork itself. And the stories that Ditko drew, a lot of them in Amazing Adult Fantasy, had to do with going through different portals and different dimensions. And why is this pertinent? Because when we get to Doctor Strange, in which he goes through different dimensions and portals, you'll know why. But look at these amazing Ditko images and Twilight Zone, and it's almost the same thing, right? But I mean, as pure art, by the way, you don't have to repaint comic book panels to get them appreciated as art. Just by showing them the size of art, they become art. Nothing Roy Lichtenstein ever did is going to be as great as just that image. And look at some of these stories. The Man Who Captured Death. This is sort of like Spider-Man and Doctor Strange almost, but yet early versions as anthology stories. This story, The Man in the Sky, is about a young man who gets superpowers. But look, why can't they understand? And if this is similar to the very next issue of Amazing Adult Fantasy, which had this guy, also another young man, getting superpowers, and why don't they understand? Why was Uncle Ben dead? What is the origin of Spider-Man? Because he was the first superhero to get powers and not go fight crime. He went to make money. It was like reality television 50 years ahead of its time. But that's why he was selfish. He wasn't a true hero. All the great hero myths, they have to lose their selfishness. They have to lose their ego in order to sacrifice themselves completely. And here we are on Holy Week, and you know what I'm talking about. The other thing about Spider-Man's origin that is deeply psychological, yet also rooted in the history of comics, is that the famous Bruce Wayne, who loses his parents and then becomes Batman, the difference here is that he feels the psychological guilt of his parents' death, not Bruce Wayne. And that is the key to what made Spider-Man tick, is because he was like a Twilight Zone superhero. He was built on irony. Now, Stan Lee, for the rest of his life, claimed he created Spider-Man based on the influence of the character from the 1930s pulp magazines, which were all text-heavy with black and white illustrations, but they're the fathers of comic book characters, really. And he claims between this and one day seeing a spider on the wall trapping a fly, that's how he came up with Spider-Man. Really, Stan? Well, that's Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. They were partners in the early 40s in comics at their birth. They created this little known character. Well, in 1953, when they were on their own as freelance comic producers, they came up with a concept called Spider-Man. In fact, that's Joe Simon's lettering for the logo. Notice no hyphen. But as the 50s went on and comics entered a downturn commercially, they tried to sell this concept in various versions. They tried calling him the Silver Spider. The only thing it shares in common with Peter Parker is that he's also a teenager, but somehow he gets his power through a magic ring or something. No radioactive spider involved. The artist that they got, it wasn't Jack Kirby, it was C.C. Beck, one of the original Captain Marvel and greatest Captain Marvel illustrator of all. Then later in the 50s, Kirby and Simon split up, and Kirby just creates these comp covers for a character called Night Fighter, which you could see has a kind of a wall-crawling ability with suction cups, kind of like a second story man would. And then this doesn't sell, but 2 years later in 1960, Kirby sells the character of the Fly. Notice he's battling a villain spider. But as the story goes, from Stan Lee's point of view, he says that he wanted Kirby to draw the first Spider-Man story, not Steve Ditko. But he said Kirby drew characters that were too heroic. So he gave it to Steve Ditko because Ditko had more of an average everyman style. Well, let's see if that theory holds up. Because according to Ditko, he saw the first Spider-Man pages Kirby drew that have never been published, and he said to Stan Lee, Stan, I think it's too close to the Fly, meaning you might get sued. And that's why Lee gives it to Ditko, so that Kirby would not draw Spider-Man and possibly get sued by Archie Comics. Now, Ditko, since 1960, was drawing a superhero for the rival Charlton Comics, but they were so far in the third place, they didn't even matter. So I don't think Marvel cared that Ditko was moonlighting. But maybe that's also why Lee felt confident to give Ditko Spider-Man, because he already demonstrated an affinity for superheroes. Now look at this drawing Ditko does in 1990 to kind of get across his point of view on the creation of Spider-Man. What he's basically saying is what we talked about, that the first Kirby Spider-Man, look, it looks like the Fly or the Night Fighter a little bit. And look at what Ditko is actually saying here, if you're taking time to read the type. And this is crucial to understanding why the artist is the de facto co-creator of anything he draws in comics. Because until you create a design that succeeds, all you have are leftover things that go nowhere. Now, ironically, look at these two black and white covers for that first appearance of Spider-Man, Amazing Fantasy. There's Ditko's original version, and then the version that Stan Lee got Kirby to draw instead. Now, once again, that doesn't make sense from the Stan Lee point of view. If he thought Kirby's Spider-Man was too heroic, so I'm going to give it to Ditko, then why didn't you let Ditko do the cover? He claims, well, I didn't think Ditko's version was powerful enough. Well, Kirby phones in this version, but a lot of people love it. And of course, here's how it looked like in color. And the same thing happened for 1963's Spider-Man 1. penciled by Kirby, inked by Ditko. This was also inked by Ditko. Maybe the reason is Stanley fell. Kirby was the more popular artist, more of a superhero artist. They wanted to establish Spider-Man, so maybe that's why. But starting with issue 2, it was all Ditko all the time. And this is where Ditko, the creator of these stories and characters that Stanley came in afterwards and just put in the dialogue, all these villains have become, in just the first dozen issues, Spider-Man's Rogue Gallery, all famous now because of the movies. Dr. Octopus, Sandman, Electro. Now, why couldn't the movie Electro have that costume? That's the costume we were waiting for. Of course, the Green Goblin. Again, look at some of these positions. We're going to talk about Ditko's facility with the human figure and bending Spider-Man's body like a human spider or just a contortionist. I mean, you can't find photo reference for figures in these positions. And yet, for such a stylist as Ditko is, Spider-Man's anatomy is very accurate, as you're going to see in some of these images. Mysterio. I think the new movie that's coming out has, what's his name? Jake Gyllenhaal is going to be Mysterio. But it wasn't just Spider-Man's great costume that made Spider-Man successful. It wasn't these incredible villains. It was Peter Parker. It was Ditko's version of the civilian identity that made Spider-Man tick. Peter Parker is equal parts Clark Kent, timid and shy, but he's also like the DC adult characters of the time, Barry Allen, police scientist for The Flash. Look at how Ditko's cruder style compared to the slick DC style of the older establishment Flash, and read the dialogue by Stan Lee on that side and by a regular DC writer, probably John Broome or something. But, you know, this is dialogue we'd hear later on the Batman TV show. Thanks, Sergeant. Probably another appeal from someone who needs Flash's help. And yet, look at how real the Lee dialogue with Ditko's more down-to-earth artwork comes across. I ought to run you in. Save your breath, buddy. I got things to do. Also, look at the world Flash lived in. This late 50s, early 60s, California, suburban moderne. And then you get the German expression as Ditko, New York City. This panel is the size of a postage stamp. But when you blow it up like this, it's magnificent. In fact, German expressionist reminds me of the silent movie, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, right? A little bit of that in there. But it was also the way Spider-Man traveled through the city by his webbing. Remember I told you about Ditko's anatomy? Look at the lines he chooses to foreshorten Spider-Man's right leg alone. You can't find photo reference. You have to know how the body and muscles work. Now, in my book, I took this great image and I turned it into a double-page spread with a quote from Ditko. And I chose all of my favorite. I had room for 6 of Ditko's greatest Spider-Man positions. And believe me, I studied every single Ditko issue. There's only 39 issues and 2 annuals. And these are the best figures. I mean, you gotta love the rear end shot on the bottom left. I mean, come on. But this is another image. You can't find photo reference for that. Ditko made that up, and yet you've seen enough films in slow motion, you know that's accurate. Even if it's maybe not accurate, it feels accurate. And the other thing is the human spider aspect of Ditko's Spider-Man. Many great artists have drawn Spider-Man in the last 50, 60 years, but nobody other than Ditko, if you look at the upper left image, has gotten that human spider. And it was right there in the very beginning. I mean, this is Spider-Man #1. And this is another aspect that made Spider-Man click. He was the first super anti-hero. He was not fighting crime and universally loved. Even though he did fight crime, somehow or another, he ended up being the fall guy, the loser. And yet, at the same time, he was also, in the early issues, feared. You know, Martin Goodman, the publisher of Marvel, didn't want to publish Spider-Man because he thought people hate spiders. People are scared of spiders. And yet, in the early issues, Ditko does draw Spider-Man with a more menacing aura in images like this than anybody. And yes, it was because Spider-Man was treated like an outlaw by the very city he was trying to protect. No wonder he was spaced out in incredible Ditko drawings like this. No wonder he was this incredible neurotic. And you gotta love it the way probably the colorist Stan Goldberg would do these incredibly stylized monochromatic images. But that's also what made Spider-Man tick. And remember I said he was a teenager. The only teenagers in comics were sidekicks before Spider-Man. It was the genius of Ditko and Lee to make the teenager the hero at the dawn of the early 60s. These are concepts of identity crises that would later become the fashion of the 60s, the focus on teenagers. This is 1963. This is 4 or 5 years before the counterculture really takes hold. But look at the difference between the establishment over 30 age DC hero, learned, erudite, with Peter Parker. The DC guy always got the girl. Look at the attitude Parker got from the women in his life, right? Even the 6-inch tall guy gets the girl. Size, I guess, doesn't matter. He was a nebbish compared to the smug superiority of the DC 35-year-old good guy, beautifully drawn, of course, by Carmen Infantino and inked by the great Murphy Anderson. Look at the difference in dreams and ideals. Betty Brant wanted a DC hero. She wanted to be in that idealistic utopia. That's what Betty Brant wanted. Look at the look Ditko gives on Parker, as if to say, it ain't me, babe. Right? He could never be this guy. Look at that smug. Are you kidding me? But that was the establishment. This is what Ditko gave us instead. People who experienced this image first time around, they say it was burned in their brains. Am I right? Joel? And that was the key to Spider-Man. In the hands of Ditko and Lee writing that dialogue, these are the things people remember. But also, look at the artwork. Look at how Ditko, I mean, it looks like being on stage like this. This could be a stage design. This could be a play. You know, they had Spider-Man on Broadway about 5 years ago, which of course sucked as bad as everything you've heard. This is what they could have put on Broadway. This is Broadway. They had it, and they blew it because they didn't use Ditko. Look at these designs. Nobody, in addition to the spider-like aspects of Spider-Man, it was also the darkness. Remember I told you Spider-Man was scary under Ditko. Look at this incredible image from this incredible cover. You know, only recently, when I took a class in the summer, that I discovered the work of this 20th century illustrator, Coles Phillips, who had a whole career based on images like this in which you had to make out the figure with your eyes by filling in the space, but Cole would use different forms to delineate just as much as you need of the figure. And I've got to believe Ditko, who knows his art, was influenced by that. But these pinups Ditko would turn out. The choice to make Spider-Man look like that is something that no other Spider-Man artist since has gotten down. One of Ditko's earliest triumphs with Spider-Man was the 1964 annual, which enabled him to do incredibly beautiful full-page images of the climaxes and the fight scenes of each of the iconic villains Ditko created. And at the same time, iconic Spider-Man positions. Look at the way Ditko wraps Spider-Man's web costume design around his arm and shoulder. No other superhero had a costume like that. Only Ditko could design something like that, so unique in the history of comics. And here's the final one with another great monochromatic underwater image. Then there were also pinups in the annual, like that. Again, nobody's ever figured Spider-Man's positions out. I mean, Ditko, it's like a primer for all future Spider-Man artists, right? But then there was this incredible story, I think 8 pages long, all about supposedly how Lee and Ditko create Spider-Man. And there's Ditko drawing himself, slaving away in the midnight oil. What's great about this story is it might have been the first time that we as comic book fans and budding young artists got to see the behind the scenes of how Ditko or any comic artist drew their material. Now, nowadays, because of the internet, there's books, there's so many resources you can find stuff, but you've got to understand what a revelation this was at the time, if you were a young budding artist, to see how exactly these incredible drawings that we love to death got made. Once again, Joel, am I right? And this image, you know, this image to me speaks volumes. In fact, I blew it up and used it in my book as one side, because remember I said the moment an artist touches pencil or pen to paper, whether the writer told him what to draw doesn't matter. Once the artist touches pen to paper, he is a de facto co-creator of that thing. And on the right side, I compiled from different early issues, and I take out the original word balloons, and I put the artist, Ditko, talking about how he created Spider-Man's costume. And look at how Ditko, almost like an engineer, really figured things out. And to us fans, we ate this stuff up because no other artist, DC Comics guys, weren't doing this stuff. Only Ditko really took the time to show us how Spider-Man's web shooter worked. Okay, that's a knockoff of the bat signal. We'll give him that one. But positions like this have been imitated for years by other artists. Ditko's second and last, well, let's say second of his Spider-Man trifecta accomplishments is this story from late 1965, a 3-issue arc where Spider-Man is trapped underground with water beginning to fill up and flood the chamber he's in, and he's trapped by this incredibly heavy machinery, and he's got to get this serum because his Aunt May is dying in the hospital, and if he doesn't summon the courage and the energy and the power to lift this thing off his shoulders, Aunt May is going to die. And Ditko built this up over the entire issue, and when you turn the page, you get this image, which many consider not only Ditko's greatest Spider-Man image, but one of the greatest, most triumphant images in the history of comics. And yet, not soon after this, Ditko walks away from Spider-Man. Now, was it because he saw Spider-Man and his artwork getting merchandised without him getting a cut of it, as he claims he was verbally promised by Martin Goodman? As the 60s went on, even after Ditko leaves Spider-Man, they merchandise him up the wazoo. These are just some of the things from like 1967, a figure model. But Ditko doesn't see appendix because he was just a freelance illustrator. Freelancers don't have any claims to ownership. 1967, you get the Spider-Man cartoon. That's not Ditko, that's John Romita, the Marvel artist who followed in Ditko's steps. Here's what the cartoon looked like. Okay, so maybe it wasn't the merchandising. Maybe it was this article in the New York Herald Tribune, January 9th, 1966, which means it was written in November of 65 when the reporter went to Marvel Comics, not Freeland, to do the first mainstream article on the success of Marvel Comics. Well, this was also the same time that Stan Lee begrudgingly had given Ditko co-plotting credit and pay for the stories that he was drawing out like a silent movie on paper. Well, Lee kind of maybe resented that because Ditko was uppity enough to speak for himself and demand that he get paid for what he's actually doing. So, what does he say, Stan Lee, when he's quoted in this article? When they ask him about, Spider-Man is your runaway success. And how does Stan Lee answer Nat Freeland in this first mainstream article? He says, yeah, Ditko's plotting the book now. I'll let him keep going until sales start to drop. Ever since he's been plotting Spider-Man, he thinks he's the king of the world. This is what a professional said about another professional in print. Now, maybe Ditko was dropping off pages that day in November of '65. Maybe the secretary who he befriended overheard Stan saying that. We'll never know. But for the rest of his life, and starting in 1974, Stan Lee would claim that he created all the characters and stories, that they all came off his type. This indicates to the viewer, the layman, that Stan Lee actually wrote these stories, which he never did. No scripts exist. Look at these articles that he would write as the 70s went on. Ditko is long gone from Marvel. How I Invented Spider-Man. Posing over the years. Stan always felt very proprietary of all the Marvel characters. He really feels Spider-Man is his. Well, look at what Ditko draws in 1999. Check this out. This is Ditko saying to you, the reader, you know that guy Stan Lee that goes around saying he created everything? That's, according to Ditko, what Stan Lee created. And then look at what he's saying here in this image. So, is Marvel's Spider-Man comic character a one-man creation or a co-creation? In the year 2002, when the first Spider-Man movie with Tobey Maguire came out, Newsweek interviewed Stan Lee, who said he was the creator of Spider-Man. Ditko writes into Newsweek, and they publish his response. You see? And then, in 2015, in a newsletter that many fans do not read, very few people know about this, but after exactly 50 years of never committing to public record why he quit Spider-Man, Ditko lays it out. And yet, it rarely caused a blip. Comic book fans are still arguing over why Ditko left Spider-Man, and he told us why. And believe me, it's complex. It's not as simple as you think. And it's really the focus of a whole nother lecture. But suffice it to say, right up until the day he died, Lee claimed he created Spider-Man by himself, and Ditko then drew it up. Well, what did Jack Kirby think? The great Jack Kirby, who created everything else at Marvel. Look at this quote. I've never worked with Ditko. He's kind of a shy fellow, and I saw him very rarely. He's very likable and very intelligent, and I'm a real admirer of his work. Very creative man. Actually, Steve created Spider-Man, and he got him to roll, and the thing caught on because of what he did. And there's Kirby in the middle of his peak Marvel years. And the Marvel Universe started off in 1961, working with Stan Lee to create the Fantastic Four, Thor, all the superheroes you're familiar with through the movies. And then they had a title, Strange Tales, that used to be mystery stories, but now with the early 60s superhero boom, and because the Human Torch was so popular over in Fantastic Four, they decided to give him his own book, but only half of the book. The other half of the book, Ditko creates the backup feature for Strange Tales that would go on to far outlive. And of course, his name is Doctor Strange, and he's a master of black magic. That's our first image of Doctor Strange. And he lives in a mansion in Greenwich Village. You know, all the DC characters, they lived in these mythical cities, Central City, Gotham City. No. Ditko and Marvel and Stan Lee, they put their characters right in New York. Spider-Man, Peter Parker lived in Forest Hills in a typical row house. And there is the Greenwich. You know, Marvel fans are still running around Greenwich Village trying to find this. They honestly think this exists somewhere. But what we all love is the great window that mystical. Now, where did Ditko get that window design from? You can go back to the 1940s to The Spirit by Will Eisner, because The Spirit lived underneath the cemetery, and for some reason, that is the design that Will Eisner gave it. But then you get the 1962 first Bond film, Dr. No, with the great production design by Ken Adam, who designed all of the great Bonds. And you look at that window in the shadow, and, you know, maybe Ditko, because this came out a year later. Now, look at Dr. Strange's, the very first time we see him in the very first story. Remember I told you to pay attention to those early mystery stories that Ditko was doing? Because if you take a little bit of this guy with the famous I always get Ingmar Bergman mixed up with Ingrid Bergman, right? Ingmar Bergman's famous 1960 film, Seven Seals, with the great character of death. And you get the early Doctor Strange. A couple issues later, Strange Tales 115, we finally get the origin of Doctor Strange in this story. And you probably know it by now. Washed up American surgeon goes to the Himalayas, meets the Ancient One, gets enlightened, and becomes this quasi-Asian looking Doctor Strange. Now, where did Ditko get this sort of unique visage from? A lot of people say it's Ronald Colman from the famous 1937 Frank Capra movie, Lost Horizon. There's also a little bit of David Niven in Doctor Strange, and you can really see the David Niven look in this 1965 splash panel of Ditko's Doctor Strange. And of course, I think we are all universally loving Benedict Cumberbatch, right? As Doctor Strange, shown here on Entertainment Weekly. Now, what made Doctor Strange and the Ancient One such a unique pairing is, if you were watching American television in 1965, this is what you were shown as the relationship between a doctor and his aged mentor, Western medicine. If you were reading Marvel Comics, you were getting this between a doctor and his aged mentor, except it was Eastern mysticism and philosophy. Comics have always been 25 years ahead of the rest of the American culture. Hollywood is just now making movies based on characters created 50, 60 years ago. The stuff that's happened in comics since, the media won't get to it till another 50 years. And it was the whole spell-giving occult aspect of Doctor Strange that Ditko really strut his stuff. In the very first issues, his ectoplasmic form leaves his body. And by the way, this is all Eastern mysticism and philosophy that you can find in all the great religions and all the great books. But it was these other dimensions of Doctor Strange. I mean, in the field of fine art, we were used to Salvador Dali and kind of the plastic surrealist images that by the 60s had become kind of very mainstream. But yet Ditko's other dimensions, and we're going to see more of them, were like nothing we had ever seen before in any art form. I mean, where Ditko got these things from, you know, I recently saw, there's a great PBS American Masters documentary series about great American artists. And one of them was about a female artist in the 60s I had never heard of. But that's because, as you know, women were suppressed in the art field. But by the end of this one-hour documentary, you're convinced she was one of the greatest artists of the 60s, Eva Hesse. Joel, you know her? Okay. When I saw her work, I said, this is from the late 60s. I'm like, she's doing her version of Ditko's Doctor Strange. Because when I look at Ditko's work, I see now two American artists doing the same thing in New York City in completely different genres, but doing the same abstract forms. But nobody did interdimensional worlds like Steve Ditko in Doctor Strange. Everything from the design to the actual mechanics. You know, you've seen movies and special effects. You know exactly what Ditko's getting at. But remember I told you to pay attention to those early fantasy stories of Ditko going through other dimensions? He would keep these same concepts, like all great artists, these motifs would repeat. And look at how Al Stewart in the early 70s basically rips off Doctor Strange for this album cover. But Ditko's influence with Doctor Strange was far earlier, in the late 60s, because all of these Doctor Strange interdimensional worlds were co-opted by the psychedelic art movement. And the psychedelic movement itself was started single-handedly by Ken Kesey, the author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. He basically smuggled LSD, which was then legal, out from these psychological labs and started dosing his friends in San Francisco. And I mean, if you want to know the story, just get Tom Wolfe's Electrocooled Acid Test, the greatest book about the 60s ever written, and it'll tell you why the entire psychedelic movement was started by one man. Because he would create the Bus Further in 1964, and Kesey, along with his merry pranksters, drove across the country dousing America with then LSD. And as Tom Wolfe wrote in Electrocooled Acid Test, he said the Further bus was festooned with images of Marvel Comics characters. Because remember, they were the super anti-heroes. So look at this Ken Kesey acid test poster, and look at the center. Yes, that's Jack Kirby's Thor. And Kesey at one point, Tom Wolfe at one point in Kool-Aid Acid Test says he witnessed Ken Kesey in the back of the bus plunged into the purple plunging shadows of Doctor Strange. So look at the influence on psychedelic art that would follow 3 and 4 years later. And every one of these psychedelic artists claimed they were influenced by Ditko's Dimensional Worlds. And look at, again, some of Eva Hess's earlier work. And it's those same abstract forms that you'll see later in Doctor Strange. I mean, at the same time, not later. So they're both doing these images in New York City at the same time. But look at the influence on the psychedelic art movement of Ditko's Doctor Strange. One of his greatest Doctor Strange images, I used it for the promo image, and look at one of the first Doors posters. And remember, the 60s were all about the doors of perception. One of Bill Graham's very first Fillmore West posters co-opted Doctor Strange. I mean, look at this Ditko 2-panel sequence from a 1965 Doctor Strange story. And then in 1967, 2 years later, an artist co-opts it for the Quicksilver Messenger Service. Boz Scaggs, I forget who the bottom one there is. But yes, there's nothing like the original of Steve Ditko. It's totally unique, just like Spider-Man was totally unique. And what would happen if you put the two together? Well, that is Ditko's Trifecta. Summer of '65, Spider-Man Annual 2, which also happens to be the very first comic I bought as a 7-year-old with my own quarter. And it was my introduction to Ditko, my introduction to Spider-Man, and my introduction to Doctor Strange. Steve, I bought it at Gorland's, and then I remember walking across the street to Sai Ho, our favorite Chinese restaurant, right? My brothers here, we shared all these experiences together. This was every fan's wish fulfillment. To see Ditko drawing Spider-Man and Doctor Strange at their peak in one story. To see Spider-Man gambling, if I'm using that word correctly, through classic Ditko, surrealist, Doctor Strange landscapes. Every one of these panels is a revelation. Look at this beautiful sequence where he gets to give you everything Ditko is just the greatest at. The daring do, along with the athleticism, the fantasy, everything in a single image. And then, of course, you get the great final image. And I got to give Stanley credit for some snappy dialogue, right? Right? Not bad, not bad. But then again, just like with Spider-Man, this is July of '66, which means Ditko drew it, in the fall of '65. And yes, he turns his back and leaves Marvel. And it is the end of Doctor Strange and the Ditko period. And ladies and gentlemen, that is where we will take a short break. Anybody remember 1966 and Batmania? Yes, it flooded. Whoop. What happened? Did we just lose it? No. I don't know what happened. That's weird. Anyway, after Batmania faded, DC Comics by 1967 was charged with coming up with new ideas. So the whole comic book field, flush with the success of the Batman TV series, Marvel Comics was at their height. They were outselling all their competition, shown here in a 1964 trade ad. And then remember I told you Charlton Comics was a far distant third or fourth place in terms of comic book producers. But, you know, they were doing their best. They were poorly printed. They were actually printed somewhere in Connecticut, I think. And they tried to get on the superhero bandwagon a little bit in 65, 66. Blue Beetle is a character that they had from the 1940s. And then we see Captain Atom, which is the character Ditko had been drawing kind of on the side, like I mentioned before in part one, since 1960. But in 66, he gives Captain Atom a whole new look, and this kind of launches the second phase of Ditko's Charlton career. But what's interesting is in early 67, what do we see here at the bottom but this character, the all-new Blue Beetle? And it's by Ditko. Now remember I said the Blue Beetle was just an average comic superhero from the early 40s that kind of came about in the wave of all the, you know, Green Arrow and Green Lantern, Blue Beetle. And I'm not even sure what his superpowers were, if he even had any. Anybody know the Blue Beetle of the 40s? But the point is Ditko knew that the character was sitting around at Charlton and nobody was really doing anything with him. So Ditko did his own version of what DC had been doing the previous 10 years by taking their characters in the 40s and rebooting them, which is a popular term now, for the 1960s. But what you really should notice here is Ditko, in the wake of having created the greatest costume design in the history of comics, which was Spider-Man, he had to kind of top himself, and at the same time, by choosing a Beetle, he kind of got the best of both worlds by doing a new version of Spider-Man that you can see in these early model drawings. This was a pinup that was based on Ditko's original design sketches for the flying beetle, or whatever it was called, the bug, that incredible beetle-like thing that you can see in the very first Blue Beetle story in that issue of Captain Atom. But once again, look at how Ditko figures out the mechanics of how things work in the superhero universe. Just like he did with Spider-Man, Ditko brings the reader into the story by giving us the kind of engineering ideas that this is why they're making superhero movies now. It all comes out of this era in which these comics feel like movies on paper. But in terms of the action, it was Ditko at his classic. I mean, there's really no difference from what he was doing over at Spider-Man to what he did with Blue Beetle. Here is the promo ad for the very first issue. The Blue Beetle was successful as a backup feature, so they give him his own comic. But what's really interesting about the first issue of the Blue Beetle is this character. Who is the Question? And who would look like that? A guy in a business suit, but with no face? Once again, Ditko takes us in on the engineering behind the character, which once again draws the reader and the viewer right into the story. But here's what made the Question so unique. This story appears in 1967, at the height of the Summer of Love. And you've got the Question fighting the bad guys in an underground like subway or sewer system. And he kicks the two bad guys into the river. They start to get swept away. But look at what they say here. Why tell me your problem, says the Question. No other superhero or good guy ever said this to the bad guy. Look, you can swing out over the pipes and pull us out. Hurry. You have to say, you must save us. And this is what made the Question in 1967 stand out from the crowd of every other comic book good guy or on movies or television. Nobody said this. Nobody would allow the bad guys to drown like the Question did. But the reason why I'm showing it like this is how Ditko intended the story to end. But the publishers made him add this panel with this expository dialogue, basically telling you, the reader, oh, don't worry. I didn't let the bad guys drown to their deaths. They'll get picked up. So where did Ditko get this philosophy from that was radical, appearing in 1967? He got it from the very controversial Ayn Rand, who is as loved as she is hated, as misunderstood as she is understood, as co-opted as she is opted. Her two foundation novels are The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. Here she is herself explaining her philosophy. The concept, now, if you love comics, you got to kind of agree with this. Man is a heroic being. His own happiness is more precise, with productive achievement as the noblest activity and reason as his only absolute. And these ideas really hit Ditko where he lived, because he started to do drawings in the 60s that are basic graphic analogs to Ayn Rand's philosophy. And you can see in these images exactly Ayn Rand's verbal statement as a kind of iconic utopian visual. And at the same time Ditko is doing these images on the side for his own personal pleasure, he's doing Blue Beetle stories like this that really begin to explore Ditko's philosophy of black and white and good and evil, and we're going to see more of this as the 60s turn into the 70s. Look at this house ad for a Blue Beetle issue that only the cover was produced because it got discontinued when the superhero boom of the Batmania era went bust. But once again, what I love about this image is it was Ditko paying homage to that great Spider-Man cover in which, like Cobb Phillips illustrations, you had to fill in the figure. Now, at the same time Ditko's doing this, his artist friend Wally Wood started his own company, Tower Comics, with the characters the Thunder Agents. And these were created and illustrated by one of the greatest artists in the history of comics and one of Steve Ditko's best artist friends, Wally Wood. This is him in the 1950s with the famous EC Comics, maybe the greatest outer space artist ever amongst his many attributes. But in the 60s, in the superhero boom, he was allowed to create new characters, and he had his own company to run, and he was an artist, so he brought in artists like his friend Ditko to pencil stories for him that Wally Wood would then ink. And many people love the Ditko-Wally Wood artistic collaboration, which they went on to illustrate many stories over the years. Maybe Ditko's most famous Tower story was when they killed off Mentor, which was a kind of Tower version of the Atom. Not that he shrunk, but the costume design. And this is one of the greatest collaborations of, you can see the Ditko figure work, but with the beautiful rendering, stylized spotting of blacks that Wally Wood is famous for. Wally Wood was a very interesting character because he was one of the first professionals who wanted to be his own publisher. And now we are in an era of independent comics, just like independent films. At the time, in the mid-60s, Wally Wood saw what Robert Crumb was doing in 66 with the early underground comics. From 64, 65, 66. And Wood decides to be the first professional in 1966 to publish his own comic magazine. We were calling these prozines because fanzines were very crude and kind of ugly because they were done by teenagers. Wally Wood was a seasoned professional. And this was illustrated fiction by Wood and a bunch of his artist friends. And he showed this to Ditko and he said, Steve, what can you do for the next issue in 1967? Now, Ditko had just created The Question, but he wanted to do an even more intense version of The Question. And by doing it for Wits End, without the kind of comics code of the overground art, he was able to do really a more severe version of the question. And by doing it in black and white, Ditko would really drive home this whole black and white concept that he got from Ayn Rand, that there is no gray. You either have to choose to either be black or white. And look at the way Ditko spells it out for you here. And in the drawing, first of all, look at once again Mr. A with the unique visage, another masked character. The whole black and white card concept. Look at all the evil coming out of the black side. The first story details a juvenile delinquent who, with his buddy, assaults some cops. And as the story goes on, Mr. A gets involved in a social worker who's trying to redeem the juvenile delinquent, whose name is Angel, who stabs her, tries to kill her and rob her. And by the end of the story, he's left dangling on a flagpole. And if you read the dialogue, I mean, this is, again, pretty intense. Because, look, she wants to save Angel. But look at what Ditko has Mr. A saying. You're cruel. You don't have any mercy or pity. As Angel is yelling, save me. I don't abuse my emotions. And look at the ending here. I have no mercy or compassion for aggressors, only for their victims, for the innocent. To have any sympathy for killers is an insult to their victims. Even if you weren't hurt, I wouldn't have saved Angel. And Angel literally falls to his death at the bottom of the comic page. And this was, again, a more severe version of what Ditko had drawn in the Overground comic, roughly at the same time. Maybe the only time in comic book history where an artist-writer was doing the same character in kind of two slightly different versions, but equally great. I mean, Ditko would turn out, as the years went on, just these single pages that just bluntly lays out you're either on one side of the card. Now, you might say this is not good comics. That's bad lettering. That's bad type. It doesn't make you want to read it. That's why all the great artists sometimes need good editors and people to say, Steve, that's bad type. If you want people to read it, you got to redesign it. Suffice it to say, Ditko maintained this world character that he would go on to produce as the 60s went into the 70s, and really for the rest of his career, would produce these black and white comics that once again lay out in black and white this concept of life and death, good and evil, whatever you want to attribute to an image like this. Now, at the same time he's doing these black and white comics, he's also doing some of his greatest black and white artwork in magazine form in 1967, right after he leaves Marvel. And this was, of course, the great Warren black and white magazines of the late 60s, Creepy and Eerie, which featured not only great Frank Frazetta covers, but the black and white interiors, really a greatest hits of comic book artists of the era. And many Ditko fans consider his black and white, these are wash tones, meaning when you mix India ink with water and you can get various gray levels. And many Ditko aficionados consider these handful of stories that Ditko does in 66, 67, 68 amongst his best. And he tried different rendering styles. I think among Ditkoites, this story is perhaps their most favorite. And speaking of collector's edition, in 1968, Ditko brings back the question after a kind of a one-year hiatus. He had done those Mr. A stories instead. Only one issue in October of 68 ever came out, but many consider this one of the greatest single issues in comic book history because it's Ditko laying out, again, not great type. I don't expect you to read this, but essentially, in this one story, Ditko lays out his whole philosophy of what is a hero all about. And it could be isolated in this single image of Vic Sage, who is the Question's journalist, broadcaster, civilian identity, has to act heroically in his civilian identity and stand up to the mob. This image is the exact converse, opposite of that image I showed you before. Now, many people want to think Ditko left Marvel because he didn't want to portray heroes feeling sorry for themselves. If you look at this image, this really, as the 60s went on and Ditko became more Randian in his thinking, this isn't what he thinks a hero should be. This is his idea of a hero. And that's why the Question ended up becoming a staple of DC Comics for the next few decades and is now one of their main characters because he's just another great Ditko character. Here's a house ad from the 80s version. And look at this house ad for the 1968 debut of the maybe Spider-Man-like character that he does for DC Comics in 1968. So this is what Ditko did. He would, like all freelance artists at the time, they would do some money jobs for the big companies. They would do whatever little advertising jobs or other types of things to make money or to fulfill their creative vision. So the minute you see the Creeper, and just the name and the look, you can already see he's got that kind of Spider-Man bent to him, literally in the kind of anatomy. April 68, the debut. There's Spider-Man in a typical fight page, and once again, you can see how that same fighting spirit, pun intended, was alive and well in the Creeper stories. Maybe that cover is one of his greatest of all time, not only just his greatest. First of all, just look at the way Ditko poses that Creeper figure. That one figure alone, from an artistic standpoint, tells you everything you need to know about Ditko's unique, totally unique approach to bending and warping anatomy, and yet totally believable for the character himself. That is very difficult to achieve. This is another one of Ditko's dripping water images. Remember the great Spider-Man cover? Ditko even got to do another Creeper cover with another dripping water image. But unfortunately, February 69, Ditko comes down with, of all things, tuberculosis, which most people thought, like polio, had been eradicated. And the great Gil Kane had to fill in for the next couple issues of the Creeper, and then it was discontinued. We'll really never know what the Creeper might have been had Ditko not gotten sick. In the 70s, he returned for a single issue of the Creeper, and like I showed you earlier, he's become a beloved character in the DC universe. Bruce Timm put him in the 1995 great Batman animated series. DC has trotted out multiple versions over the decades. Look, they even did a female version of the Creeper, and here is the most recent version I can find. So a lot of people say, oh, you know, Ditko and Kirby were not as successful without Stan Lee. Well, what do you mean not as successful? All the characters Ditko and Kirby created after they left Stan Lee are still being used and made movies out of. Look at the house ad for his other 68 DC creation, Hawk and Dove, and the great first cover. Remember I said torn from the day's headlines? Well, there it is in a nutshell. And it was Ditko taking all the protests of the era that we had seen on the news and in newspapers, classic images of the peace hippies confronting the military. I don't know what the? Hold on. Okay, I take no responsibility for technology. When it's not working, I mean. Thank you. Yeah, so where was I? Okay, so he has the Blake brothers, Don and Hank Blake. Basically, one being Don is the dove and Hank is the hawk. You like that? Right on the nose kind of naming. Somehow, and weird for a Ditko book, they get their powers from some supernatural force. You know, Ditko, being an Ayn Randian, you know, is totally anti-religion and anti-mysticism. So the fact that Ditko would have a supernatural force give them powers and costumes was kind of offbeat for Ditko, needless to say. But you can see a lot of that same classic Ditko energy. Here's how the first story ends, which is, again, another iconic image of the two different attitudes towards life, towards politics. towards relationships, you name it. But I've always loved that image. Then they got their own title, and just like The Creeper, it only lasted a few issues. And in that issue, once again, you could see Ditko's great costume design. Look at the psychedelic villains. And it was always Don that had the crisis of how to act, how to solve the problem if you are a nonviolent peace person. And this is what the 60s again were about, with the Martin Luther King nonviolent versus the Malcolm X more violent, which he was branded at maybe unfairly. But you could see that these early issues was always about Hank the Hawk telling his brother, Mr. Peacenik, you gotta fight every now and then, you gotta stand up. But remember, he got tuberculosis, Gil Kane had to take over, and that was the end of Hawk and Dove, unfortunately. And yet, just like with the Creeper, the Hawk and Dove would be resuscitated. 1970, they appear in the Teen Titans, and then in the 80s, they turn Dove into the girl, like I showed you earlier. The same artist comes back 10 years later and does another version. The Brave and Bold cartoon, great cartoon, we're waiting for it on DVD. And they've made it into live action. In the 70s, for DC, you'd never know when a Ditko image or Ditko book would pop up. But images like this go way back in early Ditko's career. He made one of his graphic signatures is those small figures surrounded by the giant faces or the very surreal mouths. Look at this 1950s or early 60s image. A character, I am the changing man. And the reason why I'm showing you this is in the mid-70s, Ditko creates this very bizarre, even for Ditko, concept called Shade the Changing Man. And if you look at the graphic delineation, he wears this weird M vest, and somehow, again, Ditko, very graphic. If you look at these, Shade can create like things you see in movies now, but Ditko drew them on the cover page. Hard to even describe what's going on. But you see, look at what the character's saying. Look, he's doing again, flying and changing. So you can almost see this as a film that somehow he can warp his body. A very unique, bizarre concept. And remember the movie Inception and, you know, and Doctor Strange, where the special effects of the cities, they bend and they twist. Once again, comics were almost 50 years ahead of movies and special effects. Shade became another character that DC Comics has been doing ever since. In the late 70s, Ditko just did this one-off of Man-Bat. That's not a Ditko cover, that's the great Jim Aparo. But inside, we were treated to something we always fantasized about as Ditko fans. We wanted the Marvel artists to draw the DC characters. We wanted the DC characters to draw the Marvel characters. So we finally got Ditko doing Batman. Only this one time. And what's interesting is the way he chooses to do Batman's face. Completely shadowed. You don't even see the flesh part of his skin. And that's what makes even a one-off thing like this so great to be able to show you on a beautiful screen like this. In the 80s, okay, I don't know what keeps happening with my computer here, but wait a second. Is this me? Yaman, or is it a connection problem? Is it the wires? Everybody enjoying? Yeah. That's what I like to hear. Okay, we're more or less on time. Should we just hope for the best?
It's fine. I think the charger was pushing against it.
Okay, should I, I don't need to be charged anymore. Should I take off the AC?
Sure, it's fine. And I think it should be okay now.
Okay, I took off the AC. Okay, so in the 80s, as soon as we get the lights down, Ditko does this bizarre character, Rom the Space Knight. And what was Rom the Space Knight? He was a toy that came over from Japan, and Japan got together with Parker Brothers, and they decided to market the robot toy with a comic book, and they got Marvel Comics to do it, And Marvel Comics got Steve Ditko to draw it. And this is the great P. Craig Russell, one of the great comic artists who emerged in the 70s. And he, like all of us, were Ditko fans. And he somehow convinced Marvel, he said, let me ink Steve Ditko doing Rom the Space Knight. So to have Ditko doing the pencils and having the excellent stylized romantic inks of Craig Russell made for some really beautiful comic art. I mean, that's as much Craig Russell as it is Steve Ditko, but that's the beauty of the artistic penciling inking collaboration that's really only found in comics, where you get two great talents combining to create a third artistic identity. And even if you don't care about Rom the Space Knight, I mean, who cares about Rom the Space Knight? You gotta love the artwork, and people to this day still have a soft spot. That's why I wanted to put it in my overview of Ditko's career. But throughout the 70s, Ditko never left Mr. A behind and would do these self-published like prozines, and again, very densely written, the same kind of hammer on the head, black and white concept. But these 70s stories really featured some of Ditko's most beautiful black and white artwork. I mean, look at the stylized inking of the shadows and the cross-hatching in that left panel, and his use of Zipatone, which was a film screen with dots that you would put on black and white art to make it appear gray. And then he was able to do color on the covers. This is a wraparound cover, and yet still keep Mr. A in beautiful black and white. Of course, I, the proofreader, will never forgive Ditko for misspelling the word deceit. You know, it's funny. I've got this image in my bathroom, the black and white version of it, and I put it in my bathroom right next to the toilet because it's a very dense image. I figure, well, people are sitting in the toilet, they can read this. And only one person in the 13 years I've been in this apartment came out of the bathroom, and when I said to, and she was a woman, and I said, what'd you think of the art in the bathroom? And she goes, you know, he spelled the word deceit wrong. She was the only one. Anyway, it's still a great image, but I forgive. Again, that's why great artists need an editor. But throughout the rest of his career, every 10 years or so, Ditko would bestow us with a beautiful Mr. A story. This is one of his last and maybe one of his greatest because there's no dialogue at all. Ditko tells the entire story just in silent panels. And once again, some of his most beautiful graphic work ever is in one of his last Mr. A stories. And this black and white look Ditko would do in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, just one-off stories that would appear in various publishers, various comics. I don't even know where I got this from. But again, it has that same Mr. A black and white feeling. Or else he would do a color story that would harken back to his great Doctor Strange era. And then every now and then, Ditko would give us another one of his oddball characters that always had a unique black and white costume design. Ditko could have been the greatest costume designer on Broadway if they ever took advantage of him when he was alive. What's great about now with the boom in comic book history publishing is that you can get the entire collection of Ditko's Spider-Man in one omnibus, as they call it. And I am both proud and humbled to say that the editor of this in 2008 liked my Silver Age book that Lockie has there and hired me to write an essay in that book about that very concept that the editor asked me to write about. And to think that my little essay is in the kind of desert island, and all of you out there, if you don't have the Ditko Spider-Man, that's the book you got to get. You can also get the collected Doctor Strange in a beautiful hardcover volume, the collected Amazing Adult Fantasy. All of his DC work has been collected in hardcover. Because DC bought the Charlton Library, you have all of Ditko's Captain Atom, the Blue Beetle, the Question, and yes, even Shade gets his omnibus collection. right? And then you get this book that came out about 2 years ago. Uh-oh. Do I keep, is it something, maybe I'm leaning on the computer. I think we're fine. I think it's because I'm like leaning on, I'm not going to do that anymore, Yaman. I'm just going to touch the space bar. Okay, so this is a book that's actually the catalog of an incredible exhibition that took place about 2 years ago. Uh-oh. I'm not even doing anything now. What's going on? Should we just keep going? I'm at the very end. I mean, we've got only... Remember I said tech problems. I jinxed it. I should have never have invoked. Uh-oh. I might have to reopen. Okay, wait. I'm going to kill the sound. Quit and reopen Keynote?
Yeah, it might be. I have the feeling it's Keynote acting out because...
Okay, should we just restart?
Yeah.
Okay, folks, we got a little minute break here while I restart the computer. It's okay, we can edit this out for the HBO special, right?
Does that mean when we figure out the tech to cross dimensions, it's going to be glitchy like that? We're going to be like stuck in between.
Okay. Talk amongst yourselves. I'll give you a topic. Steve Ditko.
I don't think you need to restart it.
Should I?
It doesn't do it?
I don't
It's
know.
frozen?
I don't know.
No, hold on. Don't restart the computer. I don't think you need to.
Just quit Keynote?
Yeah.
I was trying to quit it.
Right, so that's the issue, right? Keynote is giving you issues. So you can go to Apple,
Yeah.
go to force quit.
Oh, just force quit it. Okay. This has never happened to me before.
Some issue with Keynote. Something's wrong with
But I mean, I've lectured with Keynote for a dozen years.
happens.
Really? Okay.
Computer though.
Is that why?
It's getting
This is a loaner. It was a loaner. I had a new one. I spilled water on it a year ago.
It's old, yeah.
Yeah, is that also why?
Could be.
Ay,
10 years old.
you got me. It's a loaner from my tech guy.
Do you have any kind of screen timeout or anything? Did you check that?
What, Joe?
Did you check, like, if you have a screen timeout, like it's not touched after 5 minutes?
He couldn't close Keynote, so it just froze. Something's wrong with Keynote, I think.
Or it's the computer or whatever. But this is the first time I've ever had this kind of problem. Okay. Let's try this. Okay, and I killed him. Okay, I think we're ready to resume. Guys, we're in the home stretch. I know I said I'd have you out of here by 10. I'll have you out of here by 10. We did have our little break, remember? Okay, so yes, this is a beautiful catalog, maybe the greatest thing ever done on Ditko's work. And of course, it's not here in America. It was over in, is Palma, Spain? I think this is Spain, right? Yeah. Who knows their geography? Not us Americans.
New Jersey.
No, Palma's Italy.
No.
Italy.
Palma's a town in Italy.
No.
Okay, well, anyway, look at this incredibly designed, beautiful exhibition of Ditko's work. You know, it's got my highest compliment. I wonder if I could design as beautiful an exhibit if I had these resources. But this is the way to do a comic book art exhibit. And look at the title and look at the image they chose. This really unique Ditko self-portrait that he did. I don't know when he did this, whether it was in the 90s. He might have done this. But again, that's the enigma and that great, the name alone. You got to love that name, Ditko. Only in comics, right? But this is an image Ditko would use over the years whenever he had to do a kind of a self-portrait. He saw himself as a human ink bottle or actually in the ink bottle as this piece of art he did once again for a fan, very rare, of his two greatest characters from Marvel Comics. But it'll always come back to Spider-Man. That will always be Ditko's ultimate legacy character. A couple years ago, an anonymous donor who owned the entire first issue of Spider-Man donated it anonymously to the Smithsonian. And that's where those pages lie. People assumed it was Ditko, but Ditko never claimed he was the donor. And that is where we will leave the enigmatic Steve Ditko, shown here in one of his rarest photos that I ended up using to do this portrait of him as both an homage to Ditko and to Cole Phillips when Ditko passed away last year. And yes, it is this character, Spider-Man, that will outlive us all and will always be that design, that great Ditko graphic design that will always be the kind of Mickey Mouse ears of Marvel Comics. Yes, I'm sorry, but this image will be burned into your brain forever. So, ladies and gentlemen, let us end where we began. Now, let me see if I could pull this off. I think I have to open up a new file. I want to end where we began with, this was supposed to link up perfectly. Music up.
Spider-Man, Spider-Man, does whatever a spider can. Spins a web any size, catches thieves just like flies. Look out, here comes the Spider-Man. Is he strong? Listen, bud, he's got radioactive blood. Can he swing from a thread? Take a look overhead. Hey there goes the Spider-Man. In the chill of night, at the scene of a crime, like a streak of light, he arrives just in time. Spider-Man, Spider-Man, friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Welcome fame, he's ignored. Action is his reward to him. Life is a great big hang-up. Wherever there's a hang-up, you'll find the Spider-Man.
And ladies and gentlemen, just to put a little capper, this is one of my many art history, what I call visual lectures that I do. If you go to my website, arlenschumer.com, you'll see a bunch of icons at the type with each one of my interests. You can get my book, The Silver Age, through my website. I'm also an illustrator that works in a comic book style, and one of my specialties is keeping the photographic likeness of a person and turning them into a superhero. Recently, this is not my artwork coming up, but there's going to be an AOC comic book that came out in May, and I contributed something that they ended up not having enough pages for because I came in late. But I took this image of her and I turned her into Green Lady Lantern, as I call her, with my lettering as an homage to Ira Schnapp, of course. At the top, it says she's disapproved by both political parties. Washington, D.C. ain't seen nothing yet. This is the art director of Punk magazine, John Holmstrom, who I was hoping would be here tonight, but I guess he couldn't make it. Back in 1975, he started the Bible to Punk. Anyway, he just started a magazine dedicated to the pro-marijuana movement, and he asked me back in January, Joel, who was at the art show, what could I contribute? I said, I'll come up with a marijuana superhero. And sure enough, I came up with Dr. Cannabis, the green light of marijuana enlightenment. He's a scientist who looks a little like Clark Kent, merging human THC with human DNA with THC, and then it kind of grows to life size, and he merges his body hypobotanically. It's some cockamamie comic book origin. Anyway, he gets merged with, he becomes like human marijuana with all the powers of marijuana. He's got the green eye of enlightenment. Look at that utility belt. Now that's a utility belt. And then, of course, his very own catchphrase, which I'm hoping will become the catchphrase of the 2020s. Not hi, how are you, but how high are you? But how? And then you turn the page in the magazine and you get this. Of course, the whole idea is that in each issue of Stone Age magazine, I'll cover a different aspect of the whole marijuana thing, right? I like to notice he's checking out this new bud in the consumer section. Once again, all my lettering comes from Ira Schnapp. And that is that image. And I see action figures. I see a whole cottage industry. The reason why I want to show you this is you see this energy coming from Dr. Cannabis saying, where do you think I got that from? That's from Jack Kirby with his Kirby Crackle. as he was known for. Now, I run a comic book history Facebook group dedicated to Kirby, also one dedicated to the Silver Age, and maybe to my single favorite artist, Neil Adams. Of course, his keynote character was his reinvention of Batman. Next month happens to be the 80th anniversary of the character, and nice that DC is honoring the Neil Adams Batman, which I think is the definitive Batman. So I'm happy to say next month here at the Triad, everybody should have a little promo piece. On Saturday, May 18th, I'll be doing another comic history visual lecture, as I call them, on 50 years of the great Neil Adams Batman. There would be no Dark Knight today if it wasn't for what Neil Adams did with Batman 50 years ago. Also, you can see a Springsteen and Twilight Zone icon. I've lectured on Bruce here at the Triad, his single greatest show, September 1978. If all goes well, I'll be reprising this that I did for the Triad in February on September 19th or roughly thereabouts this fall. So if you missed it first time around, you'll be able to see it again. And then last month, I lectured on the 6th anniversary of the Twilight Zone, which actually is on October 2nd, which we will do on October 2nd or roughly thereabouts. And I'll reprise this show that I did last month. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for coming out tonight. And it's 10 to 10. We might as well, just if any questions or comments for the next 5 or 10 minutes, and then we'll be out of here.
I got a Ditko
Yes.
story. In the mid-'80s, actually 82, I think, when Ayn Rand passed away. And,
1981.
81. And my brother gave me some of the Mr. A
Yes.
books, and I read them. And at the time, I was working on 9th Avenue and 45th Street. I had planned out it wouldn't have happened, but I just happened to look up Ditko in the Manhattan White Pages and found out that his studio was about 5-6 blocks.
51st and Broadway.
And at one lunch hour, I just walked up,
Yep.
rang the bell,
Anybody could.
and I went up there. It couldn't have been more than 5-6 minutes. I didn't even sit. And I just wanted him to know how much I appreciated Spider-Man, and he leaned over and he gave me 2 comic books. One was the number 1. I forget, they're in the apartment, but I said, listen, believe me, I didn't come up here to take anything from you. I just wanted to...
Many fans they want something from him, and he's got a radar for when that happens, and he shuts the door on them.
Yeah.
I gave Ditko a hardcover copy of my book in 2004, knocked on his door. He talked to me for 2 hours in the hallway. He wouldn't let me in because he said some fan he let in a couple years before brought in a spy camera and took pictures. So thanks to that fan, spoiling for the rest of us. But I don't remember much of that 2 hours because I think I had a Doctor Strange ectoplasmic out-of-body experience that I was having talking to Steve Ditko for 2 hours. And I know George he also met Ditko. So everybody has, and some people have bad Ditko stories about how I went up there, knocked on the door, and he, slammed the door in my face. So, it was like going to visit the Buddha, when you went to see Ditko.